Hi folks, welcome to the Prepared Homestead. This is Travis. Thank you all for stopping by to watch. I wanted to talk today about Minutemen and Civil War and doing things that we might have to do in the future. You know, this kind of stuff may be out here, maybe in your neighborhood. The possibility of those things happening. I know sometimes they're a popular topic. Other times some people don't want to talk about them because they're just too much. But I think for folks like you and I, we should have these discussions and we should explore, if nothing else, hypothetical possibilities so that we can, well, do the same thing that the people that are running the joint do, war game things out so we can have a little bit better idea of what we might be facing. So I wanted to talk about that today, kind of my opinions of what we might have to face if we find this nation falling into a civil war type of scenario where just society starts to break down and we start seeing widespread violence. Before I get started, a lot of people talk about the shirts that I wear. This is one of them. You can go to Grafted in Design. Some friends of ours, they have their own little business, graftedindesign.com. They are also the official t-shirt producer for the Prepared Homestead. Some of the designs that myself and my wife have come up with are on there, so graftedindesign.com. They have their own stuff, and then they also make the t-shirts that are just for this channel. So, you know, I think a lot of people often wonder, what's it going to take? Is it going to happen? Is there a possibility? Or are we too far gone to watch Americans finally have enough and stand up, whether it's standing up for the good or the bad, that they've decided to take it to the next level, and that next level ends up being violent. I don't have the answer for that. I don't really think that any of us do, but I think that we should, if we were honest with ourselves, I think we can see all the stuff that's going on and say that with each passing day, or with at least each passing moment of craziness or event that happens that divides us further, it puts us more likely in the side of some type of civil breakdown in our government and civil breakdown within our communities. And we have to really be prepared for that. And one of the things that I find that it bothers me amongst folks like you and I is this, for lack of better words, arrogance that, well, all the conservatives are the gun owners, you know, that's where all the veterans are at, and if things like that happen, we'll be fine. You know, they don't want to push us that far because we'll be able to take care of business because we all have these and we all know how to use them and everybody's had some kind of training. Number one, that's not the truth. And number two, not putting anyone down, but in my experience, far too many people on the right that are self-professed gun owners and patriots probably wouldn't go to that extent. In fact, the amount of population that would actually go to the point of taking up arms and inflicting some level of violence, whether in defense or offense of themselves, this country, their communities, their families, their ideals, are really a very small number. But that very small number can do a lot of damage. If we look back 3 years ago, the Summer of Love 2020, we all remember that. If you don't, then there's a problem. I kind of think that that was probably some of the early skirmishes that will eventually become a breakdown. I think it set a lot of things in motion. It also showed just how powerful the far right can be and doing a lot of damage. They were unarmed for the most part. In fact, for the most part, not any sort of real weapons were used. I know that there were cases of rocks and bricks and Molotov cocktails and stuff like that. But for the most part, everything that we saw happen during that summer, there was no real known weapons that were being used. And yet they did a lot of damage. Think of how bad it would be if that same amount of people with that same level of aggression were armed. And don't think that the far left doesn't know how to use weapons. Because in fact, there's been a lot of intel over the last 2 or 3 years that some of these far left groups have been training, and training properly, that they have been hiring veterans, not just U.S. Veterans, but foreign veterans, and companies that specialize in training, and they've been going out and they have been properly training. So I'm not saying that they all know what they're doing, but you can certainly see some evidence that more and more of them are learning how to do things properly. And that's not even including how many illegals that are coming across the border that have come here to do things wrong, and they know how to do things. They grew up in a society that was violent, or maybe they were trained by foreign national militaries. So there is a pretty good chance that if society started to break down and it was just simply between the people, that there could be a lot of training, tools, and an aggression on both sides that may, in some ways, at least in some areas, be equal. And we have to be aware of that. Also, breakdowns of governments and societies aren't as uncommon as you might think. Just in the last few years, we've seen it. I just mentioned the 2020 summer here in the United States. Last year, we had Sri Lanka. Their government collapsed and they fell apart, and people were running through the streets doing all kinds of violent things. They took over the capital, all kinds of things. Look at France, what France has been going through in the last few weeks. It's becoming more and more violent. We're seeing this. It happened in Iran. It's happened in many other places, and I'm speaking just in the last 2 or 3 years. If you go back the last decade or two, it's actually quite popular. In fact, just today, in Niger, some faction has overthrown the government there in a coup attempt that was apparently successful, and they've arrested the president. Been broadcasting on TV. Of course, there's the whole Russian Wagner thing, but I think the jury's still out on whether or not that was all a big stage setup or was it real. The point is, these types of things do happen. They happen actually pretty often. And this country is getting into a place that I think it could very well happen again. And so we have to be prepared for that. We have to know what we're doing. It doesn't mean that every one of you are going to go out and know how to use one of these things and use it on the front lines. In fact, the reality is there won't be any front lines. If you think a civil war is going to look like the one that was fought in 1865, you're probably very mistaken, because I highly doubt that it's going to look anything like that. It's going to look like a complete breakdown of pretty much what we saw 3 years ago in 2020, but on a wider scale and very likely more violent. We're going to see pockets of somewhat safe areas and other places that are falling apart. And then you're going to see areas that's kind of in between where they're not constant violence, but you have little insurgents doing things, burning down people's barns, destroying their cars, destroying their farms, their crops, poisoning wells. Things like that could easily happen sporadically across the United States. Because while you can look at red states and red counties and say these are all very conservative, it doesn't mean that there aren't sympathizers on the left that might live in that county and that might be willing to step out and to do things to their neighbors, if nothing else, to get a name for themselves. This is a reality that we may all have to be facing, and you should be getting yourselves ready for that. Again, it's not going to look like, most likely, anything that was seen a couple of hundred years ago. You're not going to see distinct battle lines. You're not going to see armies in definite colors and flying specific flags. You could see foreign agents. You could see the United Nations and other foreign governments involved, trying to help the U.S. Army and the U.S. military and whatever their side that they're doing. Law enforcement. Who knows which side they're going to pick, and I would guess that it's going to be varied across the country. These fights could very much happen right in your front yard. Now, I'm not saying all these things to terrify you. I'm saying these things to hopefully wake you up to some kind of reality that these are possible. I'm not saying likely, but I am saying possible. And so we should act accordingly by getting ourselves prepared. Do you have the proper tools? Do you know how to use those tools? Do you understand the terrain and the area around you? Do you understand where you can go to find a safe place? Where your family could go to find a safe place? Do you know your neighbors that well? Have you talked to them if they are open to these types of discussions? Do you have little group meetings with people that you know and trust in your area? Do you train? Do you try to become more physically fit? Do you have the right gear? Do you have a plan in place if there was a breakdown? When we look at all the stuff going on between World War III potential, between a breakdown of our economy, CBDC, another pandemic, all of these possibilities and more, we see the ever-increasing chance that we could face this kind of problem. I mean, just look at the thing that we've been talking about for the last few days of whether or not there will be an election this next time. And if there isn't, or if the election is so overtly compromised, how will people react? They may not. They didn't last time, at least not that much, and maybe it'd be the same this time. Or people may have been pushed too far by that point, and they may throw caution to the wind and say, this is my final stand. These are real likelihoods in our life that we have to be prepared for. And I think those of you that have the skill, that have the knowledge, or that have the physical ability to plan for these things, you should do so. Those that don't, you should have a backup plan. Whatever that backup plan is. Maybe it's to hunker down and to fortify your home to make sure that you are safe there. Having things pre-cut like plywood to put on the windows, ways to barricade the doors, ways to buckle down and hunker down in your home for extended periods of time may be necessary. Because like we saw back in 2020, violence that we see on the streets or saw on the streets then could last for days or even weeks. We all want to believe that this nation is still filled with watchmen, with patriots, with Minutemen, with people that are willing to risk their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to protect liberty. And maybe that still is true, but I think it's becoming less and less true. And I think that the opposition understands that. And I think that's why we're seeing more and more aggression used. I think they're trying to push us to that point. And I'm not advocating for it at all. Most certainly, I don't want my children to have to grow up in a world like that and see that. But I also don't want my children to grow up in a world where they have full control and dictate their lives and they rule everything around us. We have to think about this. We have to plan about this. And we have to be ready for this. Because it is possible that we may face this over the coming months and years ahead. So you need to be preparing yourselves and getting your houses in order. Getting ready physically, mentally, and spiritually for the coming times. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.